Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 12. And where do you even start after a weekend like this? A weekend of clownish chaos, the threat of Russian collapse, and then an absurd retreat to Belarus by Prigozhin and his forces. This episode will be slightly different. We'll look at a couple of articles, but the amount of material that's being produced is quite overwhelming. And of course, at this stage in the crisis, there are as many theories about what is happening as there are indeed experts on the region. So we will speculate a little, but actually we're going to devote this episode to looking at some of the more interesting commentary across platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So one of the more extraordinary points has been made by Marina Czech, and if anyone has followed her on LinkedIn, she's an incredibly good source of commentary. And she points out here that one of the planes shot down by Prigozhin and his forces during their attempted coup, the Ilyushin 22, contained up to 10 military personnel and was headquartered in the southern military district. So this incident actually involves a Russian military aircraft with Russian crew flying over internationally recognized Russian territory. And it was destroyed by the armed representatives of a private military company, Wagner PMC, which is actually banned under Russian law within the Russian Federation. This level of absurdity, this level of contortion really tells you something about the chaos unfolding in Russia. But is it really chaos? Well, that's something we're going to be examining later on in the episode. And another comment here from General David Petraeus. And I think this is something that has been raised by almost all commentators. Actually, this is the one insight that I think everyone shares, and that is Prigozhin now needs to be extremely careful around open windows. His position is potentially very precarious, and his life is potentially at risk every minute of every day. In some ways, he must be thinking whether it's now more dangerous to step away from completing his coup, or would it have been less dangerous to actually push on, given that he was only 200 miles from Moscow? That is probably something that will be debated for years to come. It's also very much contingent on what happens over the next couple of weeks. And here is a comment from David Debato, another very active commentator throughout the war. And he talks about something which we're going to unpack in more detail later in the episode. And that is the way that the public seemed to greet Prigozhin and his army of mercenaries in Rostov-on-Don. Rather than rejecting and reviling them, rather than showing any kind of fear at all, we actually saw people embrace the troops, congratulate them, cheer them on. And David makes the point that this is confirmation of the Russian people's love of sadists, rapists, cruel and loathsome individuals that believe that violence is a solution to all the world's problems. In speaking of Prigozhin's departure from Rostov-on-Don, the Washington Post reported on Saturday night people dashed forward to shake Prigozhin's hand as he departed the city or clamored for selfies. An upwelling of what appeared to be spontaneous support of a kind rarely seen in Russia after more than 20 years of Putin's authoritarian rule. Now, we'll come to that point later in the episode, because in a dictatorship, there are several things you cannot have. One is somebody challenging the authority of the dictator. You cannot have someone who is as popular as the dictator, and you certainly cannot have someone who appears more brutal and stronger than the dictator. All these three things tell me that this was a genuine challenge for Putin's throne, and that this fight is by no means over. But that's not what everybody thinks. That's not everybody's interpretation of events, but we will discuss this towards the end of the episode. Killing civilians in a pointless and barbaric fashion. And in that attack on Kiev yesterday, a 25-story building suffered from the enemy's attack with horrific damage. Rescuers managed to evacuate 24 people from the ruins, but unfortunately, 5 people died. And here's an interesting comment by Sean McFate, who has been on this channel earlier last year. And he's a commentator who is especially interesting to watch because he's an expert on mercenaries, he's an expert on insurrections. And here we have those two topics combined in an unholy mixture. And his comment here is quite interesting. The Russian arms dealer released by Biden has been spotted with the Wagner Group boss. Victor Bout is another incredibly nasty piece of work. And here's an interesting comment that has been reshared by Hans Fassold from a very popular Twitter account, Bad Baltic Takes, one which I've been following since early last year. And it says, one important lesson from yesterday is that all supporters of Russia are very flexible with their beliefs. And of course, it's quite a flex required at the moment to carry on justifying the chaos that's happening, especially when Prigozhin specifically criticizes the reasons for starting the war, implies that it's a criminal war, and indirectly attacks the person who initiated it. Now, it seems that the flexibility required to justify these events or in any way explain them is beyond the propagandists. At the moment, they're really finding it incredibly difficult to pivot in the current crisis. And this point is covered by Russian Media Monitor, with some really interesting commentary on that by Julia Davis. I know many of you will be following her posting of Russian propaganda clips with excellent translations on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And another fascinating, and I think actually original comment on what's going on, and that is from Bill Browder. He asks, what next for Putin after Prigozhin has apparently backed down? And he predicts that Putin will execute a massive purge, akin to Stalin's purges of the 1930s. And certainly, if this challenge to his authority turns out to be genuine, then Putin will be becoming increasingly paranoid and may well lash out at anyone perceived to be a threat to his position, and especially his life and safety. And Bill Browder points out that Putin is not the kind of person to handle humiliation well, and now may desperately seeking to restore his authority through an incredibly tough and vicious stance. Now, that could be dangerous for Ukraine. It could be dangerous for the Western allies. But we have to ask the question, how much has Putin got left in the tank? How much has he got left to throw at the war, except perhaps for terroristic threats, like the Kakhovka Dam explosion, like the apparent mining of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, and also the mining of a large chemical works containing dangerous and hazardous materials? He may now be desperate enough to push the button on that escalation and take eco-terrorism to a whole nother level. This, quite a flippant comment, but very interesting nonetheless, from Maria Snegovaya, who again has been on the channel and was an absolutely compelling guest. She says here, in general, thanks to Prigozhin, we learned more about the Russian system of power in one day than we have in the last 5 years. And we'll come to that later in the episode, because I think there is a huge amount of truth in this. We understand more about the power dynamic, how power may pass from one individual to another, not through any kind of democratic process or rule of law process, but through the sheer demonstration of brutal force and strength. And of course, as many commentators have pointed out, no matter who is behind Prigozhin, no matter how much Putin may or may not have known about this coup in advance, what I think everyone agrees on is that Putin has emerged from this far, far weaker, far more damaged than he has by anything in the last 20 years. And that includes the Kursk disaster. That includes the Nord-Ost siege in central Moscow. And that includes the horrific events around Beslan. None of those were a genuine threat to Putin's power and authority, but what unfolded over the weekend almost certainly is. And let's end the review of the online commentaries with these wise words from Dr. Ian Garner, who has also appeared on the channel twice and whom we hope to be getting back soon. He points out that many commentators, many in the media, seem to be taking Prigozhin's words at face value, and of course the Kremlin's as well, about the nature of their deal, despite the fact that both parties lie constantly and that we've seen evidence of that not just over the last 12 months, but over the last years and decades. Let's wait to see what happens, he says. Don't make any assumptions until you have evidence to show what is really going on. And I think that is also a point that many commentators have actually said, and that is that there is this apparent deal that Prigozhin could withdraw to Belarus, that they drop the criminal charges against him because of his insurrection, drop the treason charges, which would carry an incredibly harsh penalty in law. And the likelihood is that any deal is contingent, and that actually strength, force of arms, force of character, and what risks either party are willing to take is what will decide matters over the next weeks and months. Now, there's only a couple of articles I want to draw your attention to, and those are written by Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic. Now, she is typically thought of as on the more hawkish side, but with the events that have been unfolding since February last year, it turns out the hawks got things pretty much right, and the appeasers seem to have epically misunderstood Russia, its functioning, its motives, and of course, crucially, what it's going to do next. And Applebaum asks, is Putin caught in his own trap? After years spent cultivating public apathy, the Russian president has found people are actually indifferent to his fate. Now, I don't think that's been the case all along, but as Putin's strength has waned, as he has seemed less in control of events, less the master of his domain, then I think that public support, that public sympathy has started to wane. Now, people may not be expressing that directly, pointing at Putin as the architect of his failure, which of course we know he is. Many in Russia will still be pointing to his lieutenants, to the apparatchiks, to the administrators, to the regional governors, to the military, to all those people who have let their dear leader down. But eventually that also starts to appear as weakness, the inability to actually command and control all of those underlings in the vertical system to stop their thievery, their corruption, their nepotism that has brought the Russian state low. Eventually, people will start laying the blame for that at Putin's door as well. Well, for the rest of the episode, I'd like to engage in some risky speculation and commentary. And this comes with a big caveat, a big warning sign. Most of this is speculation. Most of what I'm going to say has appeared in the commentary of various experts. But as I mentioned at the start, very few of them agree on what is really going on. Very few of them agree on the sequence of events. And almost none of them can align on what happens next. And in fact, very few of them are willing to venture ideas about what's going to happen next, because this is intrinsically highly unpredictable, extraordinary, unprecedented. Now let's start with the coup itself. Now, it's no coincidence that Prigozhin took over Rostov-on-Don. Of course, it has proximity to his forces. It's relatively easy to get there from the front lines. But crucially, it is also the command center of the Eastern Front. It's where the military supplies are based, fuel, command center equipment, intelligence centers, and of course, air bases in the vicinity, which could have proved crucial if the coup had escalated further. And also critically, taking over this city where much of the military planning takes place for the invasion and subsequent execution of Russia's war in Ukraine. As a command center, Prigozhin's actions have paralyzed that, have forced the military out, and no doubt interrupted many crucial planning and decision-making processes. Now, this clearly is in favor of Ukraine. It might be going too far to suggest that Ukraine may have had a part in it, but that is also an idea that I think would be interesting to explore. And really, that's why the title of this episode is called The Third Front, because the Third Front increasingly for Ukraine, and the front that Ukraine really needs to ignite, is violence and chaos on the territory of Russia. Because the more of that that's unleashed, the more demoralized and chaotic the Russian forces in Ukraine itself will be. There'll be renewed challenges for logistics. There'll be pressure on Putin to withdraw troops from Ukraine in order to protect the home front. And finally, the dictator might realize that protecting his own power is more important than a victory in Ukraine. This might, in fact, be the only thing that persuades Putin that his war has run out of steam and needs to end. But continuing with the speculation, this special military civil war certainly has more to it than meets the eye. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, that we may actually not know about for a considerable amount of time. But of course, the start of the putsch on Friday night seemed to make more sense at the beginning than it did at the end. Prigozhin's departure to Belarus seems superficially to be something that is almost spontaneous, not pre-planned. But again, we can't be certain of that. And we have to ask the question, can Prigozhin live safely and confidently in Belarus? Surely, if this is a genuine standoff between Prigozhin and Putin, then Prigozhin is taking incredible risk by walking away from the fight, by abandoning his coup halfway, or perhaps putting it on pause to resume it another day. Surely the risks now to Prigozhin are all around. Risks from food, risks from open windows, vehicles, umbrellas, door handles. In fact, anything and anyone could pose a risk to Prigozhin's life, at least until he's ready to hit that unpause button and start up his coup once more. And the events over the weekend have also shown where the media really falls down. The real-time speculation of media and commentators cannot cope with the intensity and confusion of the kind of events that we've seen unfolding. And as we said before, this time there seem to be as many theories as there are experts on the region. And of course, it's been an absolute goldmine for memes. We could produce hundreds of them that have popped up over the weekend. My favorite ones here, though, are the popcorn moment, and of course, the one we saw earlier, which I'll repeat here because it's such an incredible classic, and that is the tank getting stuck in the circus. And this is a very apt image because some commentators and experts are suggesting that actually Prigozhin's entire coup could be a puppet show for the masses. It could be a theatrical incident, the planning of which goes far deeper than just with Prigozhin and his Wagnerites. That there could be many more players behind it. There could be many more interests at stake riding on a Prigozhin victory. Could this be just a matter of bread and circuses, a show for the masses, or in the Russian version, sushki and sirke? And we have to remember as well that Prigozhin, right from the start, has been a Putin project, nurtured, mentored, built up by Putin, almost as a rival power center to balance out the apparatchiks, the military, and the more traditional elite. But that makes it quite curious that the videos that he's been recording, especially the one that he released before the coup attempt, actually have incredibly truthful language mixed in with a lot of absurdity and lies, it has to be said. But some of that truthful language undermines the very instigator of the war, Putin. It undermines the pillars of propaganda that are pumped out daily on Russian TV and undermine the very logic behind starting the war. In fact, in the most recent video, Prigozhin went further, implying that the war was pointless and a crime. Now, that is a crime he has gleefully and brutally participated in. And that is something we mustn't forget. He is not a hero. He's not a nice character. And he is certainly not a liberal or a Democrat. But who is Prigozhin? He seems to be an extraordinary mixture of conman, holy fool, and strongman combined. And for the Russian mindset, that might be an irresistible combination. We saw crowds embracing Prigozhin and his fighters in the Rostov-on-Don. We saw people cheering them as his fighters left the city yesterday. And we have to remember that a country like Russia, a dictatorship, cannot have two strongmen. Two strongmen who apparently are reading off very different hymn sheets. Now, those hymn sheets belong in a diabolic temple, of course, like the diabolic army cathedral outside Moscow, a shrine to banditry and the glorification of violence. But nonetheless, the Russian system is not designed to support two strongmen. Only one of them can move forward. And we have to beware of the Kirov scenario, where any upcoming populist leader is at risk of disappearing or dying mysteriously in a car crash, a plane crash, or any other number of similar scenarios. Now, we also have to consider what this means for Ukraine. In the short term, Putin may well try to escalate the war further to reassert his authority, if indeed he has the capacity to do that. But in the longer term, if Prigozhin is able to take over, it's by no means certain that he'll escalate the war. Now, many commentators have been saying this, that Prigozhin's first step will be to fight harder and stronger and really try to take much more territory, get some kind of visible victory. But I think these people are not listening, not paying attention to Prigozhin's actual words. He is condemning the war. He's condemning the logic of the war. He's saying there was no good reason to start the war and that Ukraine is not a threat to Russia. There has been speculation that Prigozhin may actually be planning the takeover of Belarus. And Lukashenko has been extremely reluctant to drag his country into the war because his regime is extremely fragile, as the revolt after the elections recently showed. It may well be that Lukashenko is falling out of favor and Prigozhin may be the man to take Belarus into the war, but equally that country could collapse like a house of cards if pushed too hard to adopt Putin's imperialist objectives. So it's a very confusing set of scenarios, and no one really knows what Prigozhin is going to do when he gets to Belarus. But what this does mean for Ukraine is that without doubt there will be more confusion and disorder on the Russian front lines. There will be a further collapse of morale and even greater pressure on logistics. So this, of course, is good news for Ukraine. Chaos in Russia equals a higher probability of Ukrainian success, and success achieved with potentially less loss of life. And there are some Russian opposition commentators this weekend who've been asking why people are cheering Prigozhin on. And I think they ultimately misunderstand. It's not because we think Prigozhin is a hero. Absolutely not. If he ever steps outside of Russia or Belarus, he stands the risk of being arrested as a war criminal. No, the reason we cheer the chaos in Russia on is because ultimately it may lead to the cessation of hostilities, it may lead to Russia leaving the territory of Ukraine, and it may save Ukrainian lives. And at the moment, for those supporting Ukraine, that is far more important than stability in Russia. And here's the interesting question about stability. Russia has a deep-seated revolution paranoia, and Putin suffers from this perhaps more than anybody else. He understands the historical significance of the events that are unfolding, but so too does Prigozhin. Prigozhin will not want to win the February Revolution only to continue the war and fall prey to another revolution 9 months later, as happened over 100 years ago when Kerensky and his liberal government failed to take Russia out of the First World War and succumbed to a Bolshevik putsch later in the year. Another point that's been made strongly, I think, by some of the commentators is there's no such thing as accidents in Russian politics. Prigozhin did not decide to invade Rostov-on-Don on a whim, to risk everything on a gamble in the moment. There's been a background of escalating criticism of Russia's military elite by Prigozhin. He wouldn't have taken that step unless he had significant backers, significant support, and had a fairly clear idea how this would end up. I don't think Prigozhin was expecting to go into battle with the Russian army. I don't think he was expecting to have to fight his way inch by inch towards Moscow. I think he was expecting that he could waltz into Moscow and pick power up off the floor, as the Bolsheviks had done in St. Petersburg over 100 years before, with barely a shot being fired. And indeed, he managed to take Rostov with barely any force at all. And those that think Russian politics is a succession of chaotic events are perhaps misreading them. Even Yeltsin's takeover of the country, where he stood aside a tank, where he commanded Gorbachev to stand down, all of these things superficially look chaotic and spontaneous. But we now believe there was detailed planning behind Yeltsin's takeover, and many of the things that we thought were extraordinary improvised steps most likely had a high degree of planning behind them. Those theatrics were very much intended to create an impression, which leads us to ask, What do Russians need for a successful succession process among their leaders? Well, it's not rule of law, it's not process, it's not democracy. It's either divine right, as was possessed by the Tsars, or it's a greater show of strength. In this case, the mantle of godly infallibility passes to the strongest man left standing. Putin is falling off of that throne of infallibility. He's starting to look like a weakening mortal, a highly fallible and vulnerable figure. And Prigozhin's star is ascending as a strong and brutal player on the scene. And it's no good projecting our sense of politics onto Russians. Politics is something that happens to Russians, not typically something they participate in. The images of pedestrians in Rostov casually watching Wagnerites laying mines in the town centre says it all. And then when they went up and greeted them and hugged them as those forces were leaving, shows us that Russians are not like Ukrainians, not in any way at all. They have neither the same history, nor the same mindset, nor the same attitude to their leaders. And that means that in Russia, things can flip. It's not a democracy. And we cannot be sure of the course of events or the processes that are working behind the scenes to determine the next leader of that vast nuclear-powered territory. Now, many people in the military will have been waiting to see where the balance of strength lies. And I think it's now clear that Putin is irrevocably weakened. It may just be a matter of time before people flip allegiances. Now, this isn't a revolution, because this is not a struggle between classes or sections of society, between different parties, agendas, philosophies even. This is a struggle between warlords. Maybe it's not even a coup, but it's much more like one warlord stealing illegitimate power illegitimately from another warlord. And things will move quickly. If Prigozhin gains momentum over the next few weeks, this may turn out to just be a paused putsch. If Shoigu and the military command are fired, as we believe part of the deal he's demanded entails, then he will have been seen to win a huge victory, which will be extremely popular, not just amongst Z radicals and patriots, but right across Russian society. And when the moment is right, he will not have to take Moscow by force. When that moment comes, Moscow and the Kremlin will fold like a soggy, dog-eared pack of cards, and no one will lift a finger to save Putin's sorry ass.